Chapter 1. The first rays of dawn had not yet broken through the clouds when he awoke. While the city still slumbered, he moved with practiced efficiency, checking his watch. 4:17 a.m. Perfect timing as always. He slipped out from beneath the threadbare blanket, carefully folded it, and tucked it into the waterproof compartment of his backpack. The park bench had left his back stiff, but that was nothing new. 62 years on this earth had taught him that discomfort was merely a state of mind. The man, whom the neighborhood children had taken to calling Chef, pulled a worn woolen cap over his gray hair and shouldered his backpack. His movements were methodical, unhurried, yet purposeful. From an outside perspective, he might have been mistaken for a retiree heading out for an early morning hike, not someone who had spent the night exposed to the elements. He made his way through the sleeping streets of Millfield, his footsteps nearly silent on the pavement. The neighborhood was a study in contrasts. Century-old brownstones stood alongside dilapidated apartment buildings. Gentrification creeping in at the edges, but not yet victorious. This liminal state suited him perfectly. It was easier to be invisible in places of transition. Behind an abandoned textile factory that had once been the neighborhood's economic engine, Chef had constructed what he considered his kitchen. A rusted industrial stove salvaged from a restaurant dumpster connected to a small propane tank. Several plastic crates served as prep stations, all meticulously covered with clean cloths each night and uncovered each morning. A collection of pots and utensils hung from nails hammered into the brick wall, each one scavenged, cleaned, and given new purpose, much like the man himself. He lit the stove and placed a large pot of water on to boil. From his backpack, he produced vegetables, salt, and a few precious spices wrapped carefully in wax paper. His knife moved with the precision of someone who had spent years in professional kitchens, transforming humble ingredients into something that would warm both body and soul. "Morning, Chef." The voice startled him only slightly. He turned to see Maria, a nurse who worked the night shift at Mercy Hospital and often passed by on her way home. "Good morning," he replied with a gentle smile, his voice carrying the faint trace of an accent he'd spent decades softening. "Smells good already." Maria inhaled deeply, cradling a coffee in her gloved hands. "Potato leek today?" "Close. Potato and onion. The food bank didn't have leeks this week." He stirred the pot, adding a pinch of dried thyme from a small container. Maria nodded, taking a sip of her coffee. "My grandmother always said a good potato soup could solve most of life's problems." "Your grandmother was a wise woman." Maria lingered a moment longer. She'd been stopping by for almost a year now, sometimes bringing him ingredients when she could. Like most people in Millfield, she knew nothing about him beyond his daily routine of feeding others. She'd never asked his name, and he'd never offered it. In a world of social media profiles and constant digital connection, there was something almost sacred about their wordless understanding. "Have a good day, Chef," she said finally, continuing her journey home. "You as well, Maria. Rest well." When she was gone, Chef returned to his preparations. By 6:30 a.m., he had filled a large thermos with hot soup and packed several loaves of day-old bread donated by Kovach's Bakery into his bag. He cleaned his makeshift kitchen with the same care a restaurant chef might show at the end of service, making sure no trace of food remained to attract animals. Then, like clockwork, he began his rounds. First stop was always the corner of Maple and Fifth, where construction workers gathered before heading to their sites. Most days they'd try to pay him, but he always refused with the same gentle headshake. Today was no different. "Come on, Chef," said a burly man in a hard hat. "At least let us give you something for the ingredients." "Your company is payment enough," Chef replied, pouring steaming soup into the man's thermos cup. Next came the bus stop on Harrison Street, where elderly residents from the Millfield Towers waited for the community shuttle to take them to medical appointments or grocery stores. Many lived on fixed incomes, choosing between medicine and meals. For them, Chef brought not just soup but dignity, serving them as if they were guests at a fine restaurant rather than recipients of charity. "Good morning, Mrs. Patterson," he said, offering soup to a woman with carefully arranged white hair and a weathered face. "I believe this will suit your palate today." "You're a blessing, Chef," she said, accepting the cup with arthritic hands. "Have you thought about my offer? My nephew still has that spare room. It's not much, but it would keep you out of the cold." "Your kindness is appreciated," he said with practiced gentleness, "but I am quite content with my arrangements." By midday, Chef had made his rounds to the community center, the playground where neighborhood children gathered after school, and the small, homeless encampment beneath the highway overpass. At each stop, he was greeted with familiar faces and gratitude, but never questions. It was as if the community had collectively decided to respect the mystery surrounding him, fearing perhaps that curiosity might drive him away. What none of them knew was that when his thermos was empty and his bread distributed, Chef would retreat to the public library, where he would spend hours reading newspapers from around the world, checking specific financial websites, and occasionally writing in a leather-bound journal that looked incongruously expensive compared to his worn clothing. Nor did they know that on this particular day, as Chef completed his rounds and headed toward the library, a man in an expensive suit was watching him from a parked car, speaking quietly into a phone. "Yes, it's definitely him," the man said. "After all these years, we've finally found Gabriel Harlow." Chapter 2. The first person to suspect Chef was more than he appeared to be was Eleanor Wright, the head librarian at Millfield Public Library. At 73, Eleanor had the sharp eyes and sharper mind of someone who had spent a lifetime observing humanity through the lens of literature. She noticed patterns that others missed, like how Chef always arrived at precisely 1:15 p.m., rain or shine, how he headed straight for the foreign newspaper section, reading publications in at least 3 languages she could identify, how he used the public computers to check financial websites, his fingers moving across the keyboard with the speed and confidence of someone who had spent years in front of screens, not stoves, and most tellingly, how he occasionally received letters at the library, his only fixed address, with no return address but always bearing foreign stamps. Today, as Chef settled into his usual corner chair with a stack of newspapers, Eleanor approached with a cart of books. "Thought you might find this interesting," she said casually, sliding a book onto the table beside him. "Just came in yesterday." Chef glanced at the title. The Financial Collapse of 2008, Insider Perspectives. His eyes flickered almost imperceptibly before he looked up with his usual gentle smile. "Thank you, Eleanor. That's thoughtful of you." Eleanor nodded and wheeled her card away, but not before noticing how quickly he opened the book to the index, scanning for something specific. Across town, in a gleaming office tower that stood in stark contrast to the weathered streets of Millfield, another pair of eyes was focused on Chef, or rather, on the man they believed him to be. "Gabriel Harlow," said Regina Winters, sliding an old photograph across her desk to her colleague. "Former Chief Financial Officer of Atlantic Global Investments. Disappeared in 2008 after the company collapsed, taking $2 billion in investor funds with it." Neil Thompson picked up the photo, comparing it to the surveillance images on his tablet. "You sure it's him? This guy looks like a homeless saint, not a financial criminal." Regina's perfectly manicured nail tapped the tablet screen. "Facial recognition is 89% certain despite the aging and weight loss. Plus, our source at the library confirms he checks global financial news daily, not typical behavior for a neighborhood soup man." "If it is Harlow, why would he still be in the country? Hell, why would he be living on the streets when he could be on a beach in a non-extradition paradise? Regina leaned back in her leather chair. As lead investigator for the Financial Crimes Division of Winters Private Security, she had built her reputation on finding people who didn't want to be found. That's what makes this case interesting. Either he doesn't have the money anymore, or he's playing the longest con in history, Neil finished. Either way, the Pearson Group is paying us very well to find out. They lost hundreds of millions when Atlantic Global went under. Regina closed the file on her desk. Keep the surveillance discreet. If it's really Harlow, he's managed to stay hidden for 15 years. He'll bolt at the first sign we're onto him. Back at the library, Chef had finished with the newspapers and moved to a computer terminal. His fingers moved swiftly across the keyboard, checking specific stocks and financial news sites. To a casual observer, it might have seemed like idle curiosity. But Chef's eyes were intent, his expression momentarily stripped of the serene mask he usually wore. When he finished, he opened a blank document and typed a series of numbers and codes, stared at them for several minutes, then deleted the file without saving. Next, he pulled out his leather journal and made several notations in what appeared to be a personal shorthand. As he prepared to leave, Eleanor approached again. "Mail came for you," she said quietly, handing him a thin envelope. "Thank you." He took it with a nod, slipping it into his journal without opening it. Eleanor hesitated, then added, "There was a man asking about you earlier. Well-dressed. Said he was an old friend." Chef's expression didn't change, but Eleanor had known him for 3 years now. She noticed the slight tightening around his eyes. "Did he leave a name?" "No, but he left this." She handed over a business card. "Said you might want to reconnect for old times' sake." Chef glanced at the card. Winters Private Security. Below that, simply Neil Thompson, and a phone number. "Thank you for telling me, Eleanor." His voice was as gentle as ever, but something had changed in his posture, a new alertness. "Are you in some kind of trouble?" she asked, lowering her voice, although no one was near them. Chef slipped the card into his pocket. "Nothing for you to worry about. Because if you need help—" "Eleanor," he said with the same kindness he showed when serving soup, "you help me every day by allowing me to use this space. That is more than enough." As he left the library, Chef's mind was racing behind his calm exterior. Winters Private Security, he recognized the name. Regina Winters had been a federal prosecutor specializing in financial crimes before starting her own firm. If she was involved, this wasn't a random inquiry. Someone had finally found Gabriel Harlow. The question was, what would the man now known only as Chef do about it? Chapter 3. The routines that had defined Chef's existence for the past 3 years suddenly felt dangerous. Every familiar face on his rounds might be watching him with new intent. Every kindness accepted might be a trap closing. Yet he continued as if nothing had changed. The next morning, he was at his makeshift kitchen before dawn, preparing a hearty vegetable stew. The temperature had dropped overnight, and he knew the people who relied on him would need something substantial. As he chopped carrots with precise movements, he considered his options. He had contingency plans, of course. Multiple identities cultivated over years. Funds hidden where even the most determined investigators couldn't trace them. He could disappear by nightfall, resurface across the world with a new face and name. But something kept him rooted to this abandoned lot with its rusted stove. Something beyond logistics or strategy. "You're distracted today." Chef looked up to see Maria approaching, her hospital scrubs partially hidden beneath her winter coat. "Just thinking about the weather," he lied smoothly. "It's getting colder." Maria handed him a paper bag. "Leeks. Found them at the farmer's market yesterday. Thought you might like them for your soup." "That's very kind. Thank you." He accepted the bag, their fingers briefly touching in the exchange. How long had it been since anyone had touched him? Really touched him, not just the incidental contact of serving food. You know, Maria said, watching him add the leeks to his cutting board, in the year I've been bringing you ingredients, I've never asked your name. Chef's knife paused momentarily before continuing its rhythm. No, you haven't. Is there a reason for that? Or have I just been incredibly rude all this time? He smiled, the expression reaching his eyes despite the tension in his shoulders. Not rude at all. Some people prefer their privacy. And you're one of them. I am. Maria nodded slowly. Well, whoever you are, Chef, you've made a difference in this neighborhood. People look out for each other more since you started your rounds. It's like you reminded everyone what community really means. The simple observation hit him with unexpected force. Community. When was the last time he had truly been part of one? Not since childhood, perhaps. Certainly not during his meteoric rise through the financial world, where alliances shifted with market trends and friendships were strategic investments. That's a kind thing to say, he managed finally. Maria checked her watch. I should get home, but... She hesitated. A bunch of us are having a neighborhood potluck this Sunday at the community center. Nothing fancy. You should come. Bring some of your famous soup. Before he could formulate a polite refusal, she added, No one will ask questions, I promise. Just good food and good company. After she left, Chef continued his preparations, but his mind was elsewhere. A community gathering meant exposure, witnesses, photographs perhaps. The exact scenario he'd avoided for 15 years. And yet the invitation tugged at something inside him, a hunger that couldn't be satisfied with food. By the time he filled his thermos and packed his bread, he'd made no decision about the potluck. Instead, he focused on his immediate concern, determining exactly what Winter's security knew and what they wanted. His first stop that day wasn't on his usual route. He walked to a coffee shop in the adjacent, more affluent neighborhood, one with free Wi-Fi and customers too absorbed in their devices to notice an elderly man in worn but clean clothes. Ordering a small coffee to justify his presence, Chef settled in a corner and pulled out an older model smartphone, his one concession to modern connectivity, paid for with cash and registered under a different name. Within minutes, he had accessed a private server through a series of proxies, checking message boards that appeared mundane to casual observers but contained coded communications between people who preferred to remain off official grids. There was nothing specific about him, which was both reassuring and concerning. If Regina Winters had identified him, why wasn't she making more noise? The woman he remembered wouldn't hesitate to pursue a high-profile fugitive like Gabriel Harlow, unless she wasn't certain, or unless she wanted something besides a public arrest. Chef closed the browser, deleted his history, and pocketed the phone. Time to return to his routine. Any deviation would only draw attention. As he made his rounds that day, he maintained his serene demeanor, but his eyes were more vigilant. He noticed the black sedan parked across from the community center, the same one he'd glimpsed near the library yesterday. He registered the man pretending to read a newspaper on the park bench, the same bench where Chef himself had slept just 2 nights ago. They were watching, but not approaching, gathering information, building a case, perhaps, or waiting for him to lead them to something or someone else. At the playground, a young boy named Marcus ran up to him, soup forgotten in his excitement. Chef, guess what? I got an A on my math test. Did you now? Chef's smile was genuine as he crouched to the boy's level. That's excellent news. Mom says if I keep getting good grades, I might get a scholarship someday. Like for college. Your mother is a wise woman. Education opens many doors. Marcus beamed, accepting his soup with unusual care, not wanting to spill a drop in his excitement. What did you want to be when you grew up, Chef? Were you always a cook? The innocent question caught him off guard. For a moment he was tempted to tell the truth, that he had once been a boy not unlike Marcus, dreaming of numbers rather than recipes, fascinated by the elegant language of finance rather than the alchemy of ingredients. "I became what I needed to be," he answered finally, ruffling the boy's hair. By late afternoon, when Chef headed toward the library, he had made his decision. He wouldn't run, not yet. First, he would understand the nature of the threat, and to do that, he would need to make contact with the people hunting him. Eleanor looked surprised when he approached her desk directly rather than settling into his usual corner. "Could I use the library phone?" he asked. "It seems I have a call to make." She led him to the administrative office, gesturing to the phone on the desk. "Take your time. I'll make sure you're not disturbed." When she closed the door behind her, Chef pulled out the business card and dialed the number. "Thompson," answered a brisk voice after 2 rings. "I believe you're looking for me," Chef said, his voice dropping the gentle cadence he used on his rounds, adopting instead the crisp, authoritative tone of a man accustomed to boardrooms. There was a brief pause. "Mr. Harlow?" "That name hasn't been mine for some time now. But yes, we should talk, on my terms." "Ms. Winters would prefer—" "I'm not particularly concerned with Ms. Winters's preferences." Chef's tone remained measured, but there was steel beneath it now. "If she wants to meet, she can come alone to the bandstand in Armstrong Park tomorrow at noon. If I see anyone else or anything that suggests law enforcement involvement, I'll disappear. Permanently this time." Before Thompson could respond, Chef continued, "And, Mr. Thompson, I've survived 15 years by being cautious. Don't underestimate that caution now." He hung up, took a deep breath, and let his shoulders relax back into the slightly stooped posture of Chef, neighborhood soup man. When he opened the office door, Eleanor was pretending to organize a nearby shelf. "Thank you for the use of the phone," he said, his voice once again gentle and unassuming. Eleanor studied him for a moment, then nodded. "Whatever you're involved in, be careful." "Always," he replied with a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. That night, for the first time in years, Chef didn't sleep on his usual park bench or in one of his backup locations, the alcove behind the Methodist church or the abandoned boiler room he could access through a basement window. Instead, he walked for hours through the city, eventually finding himself at the bus station. He stood before the departure board reading destinations: Chicago, Atlanta, Montreal, places where he could start over again, become someone new. His emergency bag was hidden nearby, containing everything he needed for such a transition: cash, identification documents, clothes different from his usual attire. One quick retrieval, and Gabriel Harlow and Chef would cease to exist. But as he stood there, contemplating escape, faces flashed through his mind. Mrs. Patterson with her arthritic hands, Marcus and his math test, Maria and her leaks. Ordinary people living ordinary lives, connected to him through simple acts of kindness. When had they become more than just convenient cover? When had their approval, their smiles of recognition begun to matter? Chef turned away from the departure board and walked back into the night. Tomorrow, he would face Regina Winters, and perhaps, after 15 years, he would finally face himself as well. Chapter 4. Armstrong Park was unusually quiet for noon on a weekday. No children on the playground, no elderly couples on their habitual bench. Chef noticed these absences immediately as he approached from the eastern entrance, his senses heightened and alert. Regina Winters had cleared the area. Efficient, as always. He spotted her before she saw him. A tall woman in a charcoal pantsuit, her dark hair now streaked with silver, but styled in the same severe bob he remembered from courtroom photographs. She stood alone by the bandstand as instructed, but Chef had no illusions about her solitude. There would be surveillance, backup positioned discreetly in case their quarry bolted. He approached from behind, his footsteps deliberately audible on the gravel path. "Hello, Regina." She turned, professional enough to hide her surprise at his silent approach. Her eyes widened slightly as she took in his appearance. The weathered face, the simple clothes, the calm demeanor so at odds with the ruthless financial wizard she'd hunted. "Gabriel Harlow," she said, extending her hand as if this were a business meeting. "You're a difficult man to find." Chef ignored the offered hand. That was rather the point. "Should I assume this meeting is being recorded?" A thin smile. "Would you believe me if I said no?" "Not particularly." Regina gestured to a nearby bench. "Shall we sit? I promise this conversation will be worth your time." Chef remained standing. "I prefer to know why you've been looking for me before I extend this encounter any longer than necessary." "Fair enough." Regina straightened, all business now. "The simple version is that the Pearson Group wants their money back. $270 million, to be precise. That was their stake in Atlantic Global's final fund before it collapsed. The complex version is that they're willing to make a deal, return their principal, no interest, no penalties, and they'll ensure neither federal prosecutors nor the SEC pursues charges." Chef's expression didn't change, but his mind was calculating rapidly. After 15 years? Statutes of limitations don't apply to fraud when the perpetrator is deliberately concealing themselves, Regina finished. "You know that as well as I do. And while some charges might be difficult to prosecute after all this time, there are enough that would stick to ensure you spend your remaining years in federal prison." A jogger passed by on the path, giving them a wide berth. Chef watched until the figure disappeared around a bend before speaking again. "What makes the Pearson Group think I have access to their money after all this time?" Regina's laugh was short and without humor. "Please, you were known as the Mozart of money movement even before the collapse. The FBI traced funds to accounts in Liechtenstein, Singapore, and the Caymans before the trails went cold. No one believes you've been living as a homeless soup chef for 15 years because you lost everything." Chef considered his next words carefully. "And if I said the money is gone? Spent or lost in subsequent investments?" "Then I'd say you're lying." Regina's eyes hardened. "My firm has spent 6 months backtracing your steps since you vanished. We know about the identities you established beforehand. Stefan Mueller, Henri Boucher, Raymond Chen. We know about the properties purchased through shell companies in Vancouver, Barcelona, and Cape Town. What we don't know is why a man with those resources would choose to live like this." She gestured to his worn clothes, his weathered hands. Chef was silent for a long moment, taking in the implications. 6 months of investigation. They had found some of his contingencies, but not all, not the ones that mattered most. "Perhaps I found something more valuable than money," he said finally. Regina's expression showed clear disbelief. "Redemption through soup? Spare me the reformed sinner narrative. You disappeared with billions of investor funds after orchestrating one of the largest private investment frauds in history. People lost everything." "I'm well aware of what people lost." For the first time, an edge entered Chef's voice. "More aware than you might imagine." "Then prove it. Return the Pearson funds and we can all move on. They get their money, you get to keep your unusual lifestyle choice, and I get my commission." Regina reached into her jacket and produced a sleek phone. "All I need is account information. The money can be transferred within 24 hours. Chef studied her, seeing not just the polished professional before him, but the echoes of the ambitious prosecutor she had once been. Regina Winters had made her name pursuing white-collar criminals, positioning herself as a champion of financial justice before moving to the private sector, where such justice came with a higher price tag. "And if I refuse?" Then the FBI will receive an anonymous tip about the whereabouts of Gabriel Harlow, along with enough evidence to ensure immediate arrest. The choice is entirely yours. The implied threat hung between them, clear and unmistakable. Yet something didn't add up. If Regina had enough evidence for an arrest, why offer a private settlement first? The Pearson Group would likely recover more funds through asset seizure and civil litigation after a criminal conviction. Unless... The Pearson Group's hands aren't entirely clean in this matter, are they? Chef said softly, watching Regina's expression. Perhaps they'd prefer to avoid the discovery process of a public trial. A flicker in her eyes confirmed his suspicion. Their concerns about publicity are immaterial. What matters is the offer on the table, your only chance to maintain your freedom. Chef nodded slowly, pieces falling into place. I'll need time to consider. You have 48 hours. Regina handed him a burner phone. My number is programmed in. Call when you're ready to transfer the funds. After that, we're done. You'll never hear from us again. And if I disappear instead? Then we release everything we have. To law enforcement, to the media, to the nice people of Millfield who think you're some kind of saint. Regina's smile was cold. How do you think they'll react when they learn their beloved chef is actually one of the most wanted financial criminals of the century? The threat struck deeper than she could know. Chef had built walls between himself and his emotions for 15 years, constructed an identity based on service rather than self. But in Millfield, connections had formed despite his careful distance. The thought of seeing disgust and betrayal in the eyes of people who had come to trust him was unexpectedly painful. 48 hours, he repeated, pocketing the phone. Don't waste them, Regina advised, turning to leave. After a few steps, she paused and looked back. One more thing. Why Chef? Of all the identities you could have chosen, why this one? For the first time since their encounter began, Chef smiled genuinely. Because no one questions a person who feeds others, Regina. They only see what you give, not who you are. As he watched her walk away, Chef knew his carefully constructed existence was unraveling. Regina Winters had found some of his past, but not all of it. Not the parts that would matter most when the full story emerged. The question was whether he would be the one to tell it, or if he would run again, as he had been running for 15 years. Chef left the park by a different exit than Regina, aware that he was likely still being watched. Instead of returning to his usual route, he walked to St. Matthew's Catholic Church on the edge of Millfield. The afternoon service had just ended, and only a few elderly parishioners remained, heads bowed in private prayer. He slipped into a back pew, not to pray, but to think in one of the few places where a solitary, silent figure wouldn't draw attention. The church was familiar to him. He sometimes slept in its shelter during the worst winter nights, with the tacit approval of Father Michael, who asked no questions but always left the side door unlocked. Now, surrounded by the church's hushed atmosphere, Chef faced the decision before him. He could access the funds Regina wanted, not all in one place, but spread across accounts and investments that could be liquidated within days. Paying would buy his freedom and protect his current identity, but it would also mean returning to the world of transactions and leverage that he had left behind, reconnecting with the person he had been. Gabriel Harlow, financial wizard. Gabriel Harlow, notorious fraudster. Gabriel Harlow, who had watched his world collapse not just because of market forces or miscalculations, but because of choices, his own, and those of people he had trusted. The soft sound of footsteps interrupted his thoughts. Father Michael, a man whose lined face spoke of compassion rather than judgment, slid into the pew beside him. "Troubled thoughts today?" the priest asked quietly. Chef managed a small smile. "Just seeking some quiet." Father Michael nodded, respecting the boundary. After a moment of silence, he said, You know, in all the years you've been coming to Millfield, this is the first time I've seen you inside the church when there wasn't a storm outside. I find clarity in different places. And have you found it today? Chef looked at the simple wooden cross above the altar. Not yet. Father Michael seemed to consider his next words carefully. Whatever burdens you carry, and we all carry some, remember that redemption isn't a destination, it's a daily choice. The words hit close to Chef's carefully guarded core. For 15 years, he had believed his redemption lay in anonymity, in small acts of service that could never truly balance the scales of what had happened. But had he been seeking redemption, or merely hiding from consequence? "Thank you, Father," he said finally, rising from the pew. "I should continue my rounds." The priest nodded. "The community center is serving dinner to the homeless tonight. They could probably use an experienced hand in the kitchen if you're available." Chef hesitated. The community center would be filled with people who knew him, or thought they did. People whose opinion of him had become important in ways he hadn't anticipated. "I'll consider it," he said. As he left the church, Chef knew he needed more than spiritual guidance. He needed information, specifically why the Pearson Group was so eager to settle privately after all these years. For that, he would need to access resources he had left untouched since assuming his current identity. And to do that, he would need to visit the one place in Millfield that connected his past to his present. Chapter 5. The storage facility on the outskirts of Millfield didn't match Chef's usual haunts. Modern, climate-controlled, with electronic access and surveillance cameras, it catered to a clientele with possessions worth protecting. Chef approached it cautiously, scanning for any sign of surveillance beyond the facility's own security. Satisfied he wasn't being followed, he entered the access code at the gate, a sequence of numbers representing the birth date of someone long gone from his life. The gate slid open silently. Unit 247 was at the back of the complex, away from casual observation. Chef unlocked it with a key he kept hidden in a compartment sewn into his backpack, one of the few possessions he guarded closely. Inside, the 10 by 15 space contained nothing that would immediately connect to either Chef or Gabriel Harlow. Several sealed plastic containers labeled with generic terms like winter clothes and books. A folded card table. A bicycle covered with a tarp. Chef closed the door behind him and turned on the overhead light. With methodical movements, he moved the bicycle and pulled up a section of the industrial carpet, revealing a small safe embedded in the concrete floor. Another key, another compartment in his backpack. The safe contained a laptop, several external hard drives, and a fireproof document case. Chef removed the laptop and one of the drives, replaced the carpet, and rearranged the storage unit's contents to their original positions. To any observer, he might have been retrieving winter clothing as the weather turned colder. 30 minutes later, he sat in a 24-hour diner 3 neighborhoods away, the laptop open before him, connected to the diner's free Wi-Fi through multiple layers of security protocols. The waitress had stopped asking if he wanted anything beyond the cup of coffee that justified his table, accustomed to people using the diner as an unofficial office. What Chef was looking for wouldn't be found through Google searches or public records. The true nature of the Pearson Group's involvement with Atlantic Global Investments lay buried in encrypted files and private communications from 15 years ago, data he had preserved not for leverage or defense, but as evidence of a truth he had never revealed. As he navigated through folders of financial records and email exchanges, the past rose around him like ghosts. Names and figures that had once dominated his existence now seemed to belong to another lifetime. Alexander Pearson, founder of the powerful investment firm, Eliza Durham, Atlantic Global's CEO and his former mentor. Trevor Ross, the compliance officer who had raised initial concerns, and Marcus Wells, his closest friend, and Atlantic's chief risk officer, who had jumped from his penthouse window the day before the company announced its insolvency. Chef paused at a folder labeled simply MW. Inside were hundreds of exchanges between himself and Marcus, strategy discussions, risk assessments, and increasingly frantic messages as they realized the depth of the problem confronting them. The official narrative was simple. Atlantic Global had made increasingly risky bets in the derivatives market, concealing losses until the position became untenable. When the truth emerged, investors lost billions. Gabriel Harlow, as CFO, had disappeared with funds traced to offshore accounts. Classic fraud, classic flight. The reality preserved in these files was far more complex. The files revealed that Marcus Wells, the head of risk and a close friend of Gabriel, had raised serious concerns about the Pearson Group, which was pushing to increase its position in one of the funds despite exposure issues. CEO Eliza Durham had approved an additional $270 million investment, overriding Marcus's objections. Marcus had warned Gabriel that the fund's disclosure documents did not accurately reflect the positions in derivatives or the leverage ratios. Essentially, they were using new investors' money to maintain the appearance of previous returns, ethically questionable and potentially fraudulent. Gabriel had tried to intervene, raising the same concerns with Eliza, who insisted the positions would recover once the market stabilized, and that full disclosure at that moment would trigger the collapse they were trying to avoid. Gabriel had scheduled a meeting with Alexander Pearson to discuss the situation and, in the meantime, had internally tagged the Pearson funds for segregated accounting, ensuring they wouldn't be used until there was clarity. The records showed growing distress between Gabriel and Marcus as they tried to navigate the ethical and financial crisis, culminating in Marcus's suicide the day before the company announced its insolvency. The truth was, Gabriel hadn't stolen the money as believed. He had been trying to protect the investors while dealing with questionable decisions made by Atlantic Global's top management, including the Pearson Group itself.